The mockery lasted only moments. A CEO, cold and cruel, couldn't resist belittling a single father trying to share a moment of joy with his son. The father took the shame silently, protecting his child, saying nothing. But fate has a way of humbling the arrogant. When the engines failed, when the plane began to fall, when 200 people faced certain death, the captain made one desperate call. Does anyone here have military aviation experience? And that single father, the man Marcus had just mocked, stood up. He was a retired Air Force fighter pilot. Marcus Chun had built an empire that most people only dream about. By the age of 53, he controlled billions, wielded influence across continents, and had crushed every competitor who ever dared stand in his way. To the world, he was the ultimate success story hero, a self-made billionaire who had risen from nothing. But success, it seemed, had come a price he didn't even realize he was paying. His penthouse was a shrine to success hero, millions in art, furniture, and technology. But if you looked closely, you'd notice something was missing. There were no photographs on the walls, no evidence of children, relationships, or human connection. Just the pristine, cold architecture of a man who had optimized every aspect of his life for one thing: winning. And in winning, he had lost something essential. Marcus Chun commanded respect wherever he went. People recognized him. They deferred to him. They wanted to be near him, hoping some of his success might rub off. But respect born from fear and wealth isn't the same as genuine connection. A lesson he was about to learn in the most dramatic way possible. On that Tuesday morning, Marcus boarded Flight 447 heading to San Francisco, where $1 billion acquisition awaited him. He settled into his premium seat, ready for another day of conquest. But destiny had other plans, and his seatmate would change everything. David Rodriguez was everything Marcus was not. He had given up a lucrative career in military aviation to be present for his son. He chose stability over ambition, connection over conquest. He pointed out clouds to his 7-year-old son and found joy in the simple act of sharing wonder. To Marcus, it was pathetic. He had no idea he was looking at a hero. Marcus had spent so many years in corporate boardrooms, surrounded by people who feared him and competed with him, that he'd forgotten how to simply be human. When he saw David's kindness toward his son, he didn't recognize it as love. He saw it as weakness. When he saw a child's natural curiosity, he didn't feel joy. He felt irritation, and he made sure everyone around him knew it. Marcus made a casual comment, the kind of thing wealthy, important people say when they believe themselves superior to everyone around them. He had no idea that with a few careless words, he was wounding a man who was already doing his absolute best, a man who was being the most present, loving father he could be. The comment cut deep, and it would change the trajectory of both their lives. For the rest of that first part of the flight, David sat in silence, his son obedient but confused. This was supposed to be their vacation, their special time together. And in one moment, a stranger had made them both feel small. David would have done anything to shield his son from that kind of pain. He had no idea that soon he would be called upon to do something far greater. The flight continued smoothly. Marcus handled his business, making sure his colleagues knew exactly how important and busy he was. David watched over his sleeping son, content in the simple act of being near him. Neither of them could have predicted that in moments, their world would be turned upside down. Neither of them knew how fragile life truly is. It happened without warning. One moment, they were cruising at 30,000 feet. The next moment, chaos. The engines roared with a sound that didn't belong, a sound that spoke of mechanical failure, of systems breaking down. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Chun felt genuine fear. Real, primal, animal fear. Because when you're falling from the sky, your net worth means nothing. The captain's voice came through the intercom, controlled but clearly strained. "We've experienced an engine failure," he said. Those words hung in the cabin like a death sentence. 200 people suddenly confronted with their own mortality. For Marcus, it was a moment of complete surrender. His empire, his achievements, his carefully constructed Lithia Euro, none of it could save him now. In the cockpit, Captain Harrison was doing everything in his power to keep the aircraft stable. But the hydraulic failure had compromised their control systems. They were flying a crippled bird, and no amount of skill could guarantee a safe landing. They needed help. They needed a miracle. And then came the words that would change everything. The captain's voice, usually the epitome of calm authority, now carried a note of desperation. Does anyone on this aircraft have military aviation experience? Any fighter pilots? It was a long shot, a desperate gamble. The odds of having a qualified pilot on a commercial flight were astronomical. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. In seat 1B, David Rodriguez heard those words, and something awakened inside him. 7 years ago, he had walked away from military aviation. He had chosen to be a present father, a desk job, stability. He had buried that part of himself, the pilot, the fighter, the man trained to handle impossible situations. But some callings never truly go away. And when his country when 200 Solsi Euro needed him, he couldn't ignore it. David Rodriguez stood up, kissed his son goodbye, and walked toward the cockpit. In that moment, he left behind the civilian life he had carefully constructed. He became something else, a fighter pilot, a protector, a hero. And Marcus Chun, watching from his seat, suddenly understood that he had been sitting next to someone far greater than himself the entire time. And suddenly, Marcus Chun, the ruthless CEO, the man who had spent years perfecting emotional distancia, found himself holding a terrified 7-year-old boy. The armor he had built around his heart cracked. For the first time in years, he felt something genuine. He felt the need to protect, to comfort, to be present for another human being. He felt love in its most basic and pure form. David entered the cockpit and instantly became someone else. Captain Harrison saw it immediately. This man knew what he was looking at. The failed engines, the compromised hydraulic systems, the complex web of problems that should have been impossible to solve. David assessed the situation in seconds. And then he did something remarkable. He didn't panic. He took control. The situation was catastrophic. 2 engines, one completely failed. The hydraulic systems that controlled the flight's surfaces were compromised. They were essentially flying a dead aircraft. The only reason they were still in the air was momentum and the last working engine. And they were losing altitude. They had, David calculated quickly, perhaps 30 to 40 minutes before they would have to attempt an emergency landing. And landing an aircraft with these systems failures was, by any reasonable measure, impossible. David began working through the problem systematically. He had the pilots make specific adjustments to the remaining engine, compensating for the aerodynamic imbalance caused by the failed engine. He guided them through procedures to manually activate backup control systems. He calculated fuel consumption, weight distribution, and descent rates. He was performing surgery on an aircraft at 30,000 feet, and the lives of 200 people depended on his precision. Back in the cabin, Marcus found himself holding a conversation that would change him forever. Daniel asked about his father, about whether they would survive, about his fears. And Marcus, instead of dismissing the boy or retreating into cold silence, spoke from a place deep inside himself that he thought he had killed years ago. He told Daniel about being scared as a child. He told him about loss. And he told him about hope. For 40 minutes, David worked with the pilots. 40 minutes of precise calculations, careful adjustments, and nerves of steel. They were descending now, heading toward the nearest suitable airport. The ground was visible below. Rescue vehicles were being positioned. The whole nation was watching, holding its breath, waiting to see if an impossible rescue was possible. The runway appeared through the haze. Fire trucks and ambulances were positioned along its length. Tower control had cleared all other traffic. Everyone was ready. The next few seconds would determine whether 200 people lived or died. David guided Captain Harrison through the approach, his voice steady, his instructions precise. The wheels touched down. For a moment that felt like an eternity, it seemed like the aircraft might skid, might veer, might break apart. But David's guidance, Captain Harrison's skill, and sheer determination combined in that moment. and the aircraft stayed on the runway. The aircraft slowed. The wheels stayed on the pavement. The damaged, crippled aircraft that should never have made it down safely came to a stop. And for a moment, the entire cabin held its breath. Then, understanding flooded in. They had survived. Against impossible odds, they were alive. David emerged from the cockpit and saw his son. Everything else fell away. The danger that had passed, the incredible feat he had just accomplished, the 200 lives he had saved. All that mattered was his son. And when Daniel ran into his arms, David held him like he might never let him go. And Marcus Chun, watching this scene, felt something shift inside him that could never shift back. As passengers filed off the aircraft, as the media began to arrive and the story began to spread across the world, something remarkable had already happened inside that plane. A man had saved 200 lives. A child had learned about his father's heroism. And a billionaire had learned that he had been living in poverty all along the poverty of disconnection, of fear, of emotional isolation. When David approached Marcus, it would have been easy for the billionaire to take credit, to minimize the moment, to retreat back into his armor of indifference. But something had changed. Marcus looked at this man, this hero, this father, this ordinary person who had done the extraordinary, and he couldn't lie anymore. He couldn't pretend that his empire mattered more than connection. He couldn't hide from his own humanity. In the weeks that followed, Marcus did something he had never done before. He sought help. He found a therapist and began the painful work of understanding why he had built walls so high around his heart. He began to process his childhood, his parents, his own fears about connection and vulnerability. It was difficult, humbling work, but it was necessary. Marcus became a presence in David and Daniel's lives. He took Daniel to baseball games, helped with homework, showed up to school plays. He wasn't trying to buy their affection with money. He was giving something far more valuable: his time, his presence, his genuine care. And in receiving their friendship, he began to understand what he had been missing all his life. Marcus restructured his entire company. He reduced his work hours from 80 per week to 50. He implemented mental health support programs. He created opportunities for meaningful connection between employees. He established profit-sharing plans so workers benefited from the company's success. He transformed Zenith Industries from a ruthless competitive machine into a company that valued both success and humanity. He found that you could still make money while also making a difference. Marcus called his ex-wife and apologized for his failures as a partner. He reached out to his adult daughter, whom he had largely ignored during her childhood, focused instead on building his empire. He told her about the flight, about David, about Daniel, and about how he had finally understood what he had been missing. Sarah was cautious at first. She had been hurt too many times by her father's emotional distance. But over time, they built a genuine relationship. They became a real family. Marcus donated significantly to veteran support organizations. He funded mental health programs, transition services, and community building initiatives. He did this not for recognition. In fact, he often anonymized his donations, but because he understood that people like David, people who had sacrificed for others, deserve support and care. The story made headlines around the world. Media outlets loved the narrative. The successful CEO humbled by a humble hero, the dramatic rescue, the transformation of a man's life. But what the headlines missed was the real story. This wasn't about a CEO learning a lesson. This was about a human being remembering how to be human. The story made headlines around the world. Media outlets loved the narrative. The successful CEO humbled by a humble hero, the dramatic rescue, the transformation of a man's life. But what the headlines missed was the real story. This wasn't about a CEO learning a lesson. This was about a human being remembering how to be human. David Rodriguez never sought recognition for his actions on that flight. He was simply a father who had been called upon to do what needed to be done, and he had answered the call. What changed for David wasn't his life or his career. He was content with his desk job and his time with his son. What changed was knowing that his sacrifice, his choice to step away from glory and recognition to be a present father, had meaning. And that meaning was amplified when he saw how his action inspired another man to transform his entire life. In Marcus's office now, if you look carefully, you won't find pictures of his corporate achievements. Instead, you'll see photographs of the people he loves, the relationships he's built, the community he's become a part of. His empire is still there. Zenith Industries is thriving, but it's no longer his identity. His identity is now tied to connection, to presence, to the lives he's touched and the lives that have touched him. David Rodriguez, when asked about his heroism on that flight, always downplays his own role. He talks about training, about responsibility, about simply doing what needed to be done. But when the conversation turns to Marcus, David's perspective is clear. He sees in Marcus's transformation a kind of heroism that may be less dramatic than piloting a crippled aircraft, but equally important. The heroism of a person willing to completely remake themselves, to admit their failures, to learn how to be human again. Daniel Rodriguez grew up knowing two versions of Marcus Chun. He knew the cold, dismissive man who mocked his father on an airplane, and he knew the man who would become like an uncle to him, a mentor, a friend. That dual knowledge gave Daniel something invaluably an understanding that people can change, that redemption is possible, that we are not permanently defined by our worst moments. It made him a better, more compassionate person. Marcus began sharing his story with other high-level executives and business leaders. He spoke about how easy it is to lose yourself in the pursuit of power and wealth, how disconnection becomes normalized, how you can look around and realize you have everything but possess nothing. He spoke about the grace of having a second chance, about the courage required to change, about the rewards that come from building a life around people rather than accomplishments. A memorial was erected at the airport where they landed, honoring all those involved in saving Flight 447. Captain Harrison, who passed away before he could see how profoundly he had impacted the world, is remembered as a hero. David is remembered as the quiet, humble man who came forward when needed. And Marcus? Marcus is remembered by those who know him not as the successful CEO, but as the man who had the courage to be transformed. On the one-year anniversary of the flight, Marcus, David, and Daniel met at their favorite restaurant. What had started as a crisis had become a profound friendship. They had navigated through media attention, through the initial shock of the incident, and come out the other side with something genuine and lasting. They weren't bonded by trauma, they were bonded by the choice, made individually by each of them, to let that trauma transform them into better people. A foundation was established in David's name to support military veterans in their transition to civilian life. Marcus provided the initial funding, but more importantly, he gave his time and his vision to make it matter. Veterans who had sacrificed for their country found support, mentorship, and community. And in giving, Marcus found something he had never found in his years of accumulating wealth. The profound satisfaction of making a tangible difference in people's lives. When asked about his transformation, Marcus would say something remarkable. He would say that he hadn't really changed. He had just finally started being honest about who he actually was underneath all the armor. The power-hungry, emotionally isolated CEO was a character he had created, a performance he had perfected. But underneath that performance, he had always been capable of connection, of love, of being human. It just took a flight crisis and a humble hero to remind him. Marcus became a mentor to a generation of young business leaders. He told them, "Build your empire if you wish. Accumulate your wealth and your accolades. But do not do what I did. Do not build a life so focused on winning that you forget what winning is actually for. You cannot take money with you when you die. You cannot take power with you. But the relationships you've built, the people you've loved, the difference you've made in people's lives, that is what remains. That is what matters." Years later, Marcus and David visited the aircraft that had nearly claimed their lives. It had been preserved as a museum piece, a reminder of human fragility and human resilience. Standing before it, they could still feel the fear, still remember the moment when everything hung in the balance. But they could also feel gratitude that they had survived, gratitude that they had found each other, gratitude that a crisis had become the doorway to transformation. You know, Marcus said to David one evening, if that flight hadn't crashed, I would still be the same person I was before. I would still be empty inside, no matter how much I had, and I would never have known you. That terrifies me, how close I came to living and dying without ever truly living. David nodded, understanding completely. Maybe the crash wasn't a disaster, David said. Maybe it was exactly what needed to happen. For both of us. Sarah had spent years angry at her father for his absence, for his emotional distance, for choosing his career over his family. But after the flight, she began to see something different. She saw a man genuinely attempting to make amends, to understand his failures, to be present. It didn't erase the posterior, the pain was still real. But it offered something valuable, the possibility of healing. She didn't just forgive her father. She learned to trust him again. Marcus wrote in his journal, I spent 50 years building an empire I didn't need. I spent 50 years running from connection because I thought it would make me weak. I thought that isolation was strength, that disconnection was control, that never needing anyone was freedom. I was wrong about all of it. The strongest people I've ever met are the ones who are brave enough to be vulnerable, who choose connection over conquest, who understand that the measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but who you become and how you treat others. This was the wisdom that only came after the crash, after hitting rock bottom, after meeting a hero who showed him what real strength looks like. 5 years after the crash, the ripple effects of that incident continued to expand. The David Rodriguez Foundation has provided support and resources to over 5,000 military veterans. Zenith Industries, under Marcus's transformed leadership, has become a model for ethical corporate practice. Daniel Rodriguez is thriving in his teenage years, shaped by two father figures who taught him about both ambition and integrity. Sarah has reconciled with her father, and they speak almost weekly. And Marcus Chun, the man who had everything but was living in poverty, has finally built a life worth living. Marcus became a speaker on the topics of leadership, transformation, and human connection. He would tell audiences, I built a multi-billion-dollar empire. I thought that was success, but I was bankrupt in every way that mattered. I was spiritually empty. I was emotionally disconnected. I was alone despite being surrounded by people who wanted things from me. Then a flight crisis taught me something I should have known all along, that the only empire worth building is the empire of human connection, that the only wealth that matters is the wealth of relationships, that the only success that endures is the success of becoming a better human being. I wasted 50 years learning this. Don't waste your life learning it too. The time to start building genuine connection is now. The time to choose people over power is now. The time to be brave enough to be vulnerable is now. A decade after Flight 447 nearly crashed, the three men gathered as they had done almost every year since the incident. They were older now. Life had moved on. New challenges had emerged. But their friendship remained solid, real, and deeply meaningful. Marcus looked at David and Daniel and felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He had been given a second chance. He had been shown, in the most dramatic way possible, what really mattered. And he had spent every day since trying to honor that lesson. What remained after the dust settled was not a story of a helicopter rescue or a dramatic savior, though that had happened. What remained was the story of transformation, of a man who had everything learning that he had nothing, of a hero learning that his greatest gift was not his skills but his character, of a child learning that both his father and another adult in his life could model courage and integrity. The legacy of that flight was not measured in news headlines or corporate success metrics. It was measured in changed hearts, altered priorities, and lives lived with genuine meaning. If the old Marcus Chun could see the new Marcus Chun, he would barely recognize himself. He would see a man who has given away billions to causes he believes in, a man who has reduced his work hours, a man who prioritizes family dinners and friendships over business deals, a man who cries at movies and admits his fears, a man who is vulnerable. To the old Marcus, this would look like weakness, like failure, like a waste of potential. But to the new Marcus, this is everything he ever wanted and never knew he needed. And so, the story of Flight 447 comes down to a simple question, a question that everyone must answer for themselves. What really matters? Is it the empire you build? Is it the wealth you accumulate? Is it the power you wield? Or is it the connections you make? Is it the people you love? Is it the difference you make in someone's life? Is it being present for the moments that matter? Marcus Chin's answer to that question changed his entire life. And perhaps, in hearing his story, you might ask yourself the same question. Because the truth is, we all have the capacity to transform. We all have the capacity to choose connection over conquest, presence over power, love over legacy. We just need to be brave enough to do it. The story of Marcus Chun and David Rodriguez is ultimately a story of hope. It's a story that says that no matter how far you've gone down the wrong path, redemption is possible. No matter how disconnected you've become, connection is possible. No matter how empty your life feels despite your success, you can rebuild it around what truly matters. A flight nearly ended in tragedy. Instead, it became the beginning of transformation for everyone involved. And that transformation continues to ripple outward, touching lives, changing perspectives, offering hope to others who might be caught in the same trap of disconnection and empty success. This is the power of being brave enough to change. This is the beauty of human redemption.